There are moments in history when the fate of nations hangs not on the size of their armies, but on the spirit of their people. In the 13th century, when the Mongol Empire swept across the world like an unstoppable storm, kingdoms fell one after another, unable to withstand its fury. But in the dense jungles and misty rivers of Southeast Asia, a small kingdom would rise to challenge that storm. This is the story of Dai Viet, ancient Vietnam, the land that defied the Great Khan and proved that courage and strategy could triumph over sheer power. In the middle of the 13th century, the world trembled before the might of a single empire, the Mongols. From the Black Sea to the Pacific, their armies had devastated entire kingdoms. No civilization, neither Muslim, European, nor Chinese, seemed capable of resisting their relentless expansion. Yet far to the south, a small agricultural kingdom was about to show that even the invincible could bleed. That kingdom was Dai Viet, ancient Vietnam. Its people, long accustomed to surviving among empires, had forged an identity of iron through centuries of resistance against Chinese domination. In 1225, the Tran dynasty came to power, reorganizing the nation with a disciplined military structure and a stable administrative system. Their young emperor, Tran Tong, understood one truth. Beside a power like the Mongol Yuan Empire, survival meant resistance. In the north, Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, had transformed his ancestors' nomadic legacy into a vast imperial machine. By 1271, he proclaimed the Yuan dynasty and established his capital in Dadu, modern-day Beijing. His ambition reached beyond conquest. He sought control of trade, diplomacy, and influence across the entire Asian continent. To achieve that, he needed to subdue Southeast Asia, the vital route connecting China with the Indian Ocean and the Islamic world. The first step was Dai Viet. In 1257, before his official enthronement as emperor, Kublai ordered an expedition led by Yuri Ankadai, son of the legendary General Subutai. His mission was straightforward: punish the kingdom that refused to acknowledge Mongol supremacy. The army crossed the border through the Lang Sun Pass, advancing with the same lightning tactics that had made Eurasia tremble. In a matter of days, Vietnamese defenses crumbled, and by January 1258, the capital, Tang Long, modern Hanoi, had fallen. But inside the city, there was nothing to plunder. The houses were burning, the barns were empty, and the people were gone. The Vietnamese had executed the strategy of Vuan Con Na Trong: empty gardens, empty houses. Everything was abandoned to deprive the invaders of food and shelter. While the Mongols wandered through a dead capital, Tran Tong and his army withdrew to the northern mountains. There, under the command of the young strategist Tran Hung Dao, they began a war of attrition. There would be no grand battles, only an invisible nightmare. Ambushes in the forests, sabotaged bridges, surprise raids from rivers and marshes. The tropical climate turned into Vietnam's greatest weapon. Torrential rains, sweltering humidity, and disease decimated the invaders. The Mongols' horses, the very core of their military strength, died without pasture. Exhausted, sick, and starving, soldiers collapsed without ever meeting the enemy face to face. In just a month, the mighty invasion force was on the brink of collapse. Deprived of supplies and morale, Yuri Ankadai ordered a retreat toward Yunnan. The withdrawal quickly descended into chaos. Vietnamese guerrillas struck from the forests, destroying convoys and annihilating stragglers. For an army that prided itself on crushing nations within weeks, this campaign ended as humiliation. For the first time, an expeditionary force of the Great Khan had been forced to abandon conquered territory. For Dai Viet, the victory was not merely military, it was spiritual. They had defeated the heirs of Genghis Khan with intelligence, strategy, and an unyielding understanding of their homeland. The message was clear: to defeat the world's greatest power, one did not need endless legions, only a people unwilling to kneel. But the Yuan Empire did not forget. In the imperial halls of Dadu, the name of Dai Viet became a thorn in Kublai Khan's pride. The Great Khan tolerated no defiance, and on his maps, that small green kingdom was more than a mark. It was an open wound. Peace would not last. The thunder of hooves would return, and this time, the Vietnamese resistance would become legendary. After the humiliation of 1258, Kublai Khan never forgave Dai Viet's defiance. For years, the Vietnamese court continued to send symbolic tributes to the Yuan capital, trying to preserve a fragile peace. But both sides knew that another war was inevitable. The Vietnamese fortified their river defenses, rebuilt their navy and army, and placed supreme command under the genius of Tran Hung Dao, nephew of the emperor. Meanwhile, in the north, the Yuan Empire had completed its conquest of China and now considered itself ruler of the civilized world. Kublai's ambition was to establish a vast network of vassal states, Korea, Japan, Kampa, and Dai Viet, forming a united Asia under his seal. And anyone who dared to resist that vision would face the full wrath of the Great Khan. In the year 1284, Kublai Khan, ruler of the mighty Yuan Empire, launched a second invasion of Dai Viet, modern-day Vietnam. This time, the campaign would be absolute, a full-scale attempt to subjugate the nation once and for all. To achieve this, he divided his vast forces into two separate fronts. From the north, Prince Tran Hung led a powerful army through the rugged passes of the borderlands. From the south, General Toa Du advanced from the kingdom of Kampa, an ally of the Mongols. Their coordinated strategy was brutal in its simplicity. Crush Dai Viet between two converging forces, leaving no room for escape or resistance. Vietnamese chronicles recorded that the Mongol Yuan invasion force numbered over 500,000 men. Though historians believe the actual number was smaller, it was still among the largest military campaigns of the 13th century. In December of that year, the northern columns crossed the Chi Lang Pass and began their march toward the Red River Delta, while the southern army moved up the coast, seizing strategic positions and pushing inland toward Thanh Hoa. The Vietnamese court, under Emperor Tran Nan Tong and the revered General Tran Hung Dao, recognized that they could not meet such a massive army in open battle. They chose instead to abandon the capital, Thanh Long, evacuating the city before the invaders arrived. Their strategy was one of patience and endurance. Avoid decisive engagements, exhaust the invaders, and destroy their ability to sustain themselves. The Tran dynasty had studied the Mongol tactics carefully. They knew that the Mongol military machine relied not only on speed and discipline, but also on long and vulnerable supply lines stretching deep into foreign territory. If those lines could be severed, even the mightiest army would crumble. Over the following months, Vietnam became a land of fire and resistance. Villagers fled their homes, burned their fields, and hid their food supplies in mountain caves. Guerrilla fighters harassed Mongol convoys, cut bridges, ambushed patrols, and struck supply trains at every turn. Yuan chronicles tell of relentless attacks that seemed to rise from the very rice paddies, as though the land itself had turned against them. Disease, hunger, and exhaustion began to take a toll on the invaders. By the spring of 1285, the northern army under Prince Tran Hung reached the abandoned capital of Thanh Long and occupied it, believing victory was secured. But the triumph was hollow. The city was deserted, stripped of supplies, and communication with Toa Du's southern army had been completely severed. Vietnamese commanders Tran Not Duet and Tran Quang Khai had taken control of the vital river routes and mountain passes, isolating the two Mongol fronts from one another. Meanwhile, in the south, General Toa Du attempted to march north and link up with Tran Hung's main force. But near Ham Tu, his army was intercepted by a combined Vietnamese force, infantry, archers, and riverine units working in perfect coordination. The Battle of Ham Tu in May 1285 became a turning point. Toa Du was killed in combat, and his army disintegrated soon after. With the southern front annihilated, Tran Hung's position in the north became untenable. The Vietnamese launched a massive counteroffensive, striking from all directions. Battles erupted across the Red River Delta, Chuang, Duong, Tai Caith, Van Keep, each one a devastating blow to the retreating Yuan forces. Prince Tran Hung himself was wounded and forced into a desperate flight back toward the Chinese border. Legend says that to escape Vietnamese ambushes, he hid inside a copper tube to avoid poisoned arrows, a haunting image of humiliation for an empire once thought invincible. By July 1285, the remnants of the Yuan army had crossed back into China, leaving behind tens of thousands of dead soldiers scattered across the forests and rivers of northern Vietnam. Dai Viet had endured. The invincible Mongols had been defeated once more. But even in victory, Emperor Tran Hung Dao understood the danger of pride. The Yuan Empire still loomed vast and powerful to the north. Seeking to secure peace, the emperor sent envoys bearing tribute and respectful words to Kublai Khan's court, a gesture of diplomacy rather than submission. It was a calculated move, meant to buy time and stability. As the scholar Hung Dao once wrote, "If the enemy withdraws and we meet them with arrogance, war will return." For a few brief years, peace held. Yet in the heart of the Khan, the humiliation festered. Yuan chronicles later wrote that the blood of the south had not yet cooled. By 1287, Kublai Khan had resolved to erase the shame of his defeats once and for all. He ordered a third and final invasion of Dai Viet, larger, more ambitious, and more meticulously planned than the ones before. 3 massive armies would advance simultaneously, one from the north, one from the west, and one by sea. It was a campaign supported by an enormous fleet of over 600 ships, transporting tens of thousands of soldiers, weapons, and grain supplies. No kingdom in Southeast Asia had ever faced such an overwhelming force. Once again, Prince Tran Hung was appointed to command the invasion, accompanied by experienced generals like Omar and Phan Thiep. At sea, Admiral Truong Van Ho led the enormous fleet tasked with maintaining the supply chain, transporting grain and equipment from southern China to the Gulf of Tonkin. The plan was to crush Dai Viet in a war of complete annihilation. But the Vietnamese had learned from experience. General Tran Hung Dao, the hero of the previous campaigns, understood the enemy's greatest weakness, logistics. "Cut their food," he declared, "and their army will devour itself." His strategy was not to meet the Mongols head-on, but to starve them out. Every plan, every ambush, every naval maneuver would now revolve around one target, the massive Yuan supply fleet. For in that fleet lay the lifeblood of Kublai Khan's war machine, and without it, even the greatest empire on earth would collapse into chaos. In December of 1287, deep within the emerald waters of Van Don Bay, history unfolded in a way that few could have imagined. The Mongol Yuan Empire, under the command of Prince Togon, known in Vietnamese chronicles as Tran Hung, had launched its third and most ambitious invasion of Dai Viet, the ancient name for Vietnam. Kublai Khan, the great emperor of the Mongols and ruler of the vast Yuan dynasty, believed this campaign would finally bring the stubborn Vietnamese kingdom to heel. His forces, a powerful combination of cavalry, infantry, and an enormous fleet, descended upon the region with the confidence of an empire that had conquered nearly every enemy it had faced, from the walls of China to the steppes of Central Asia. But what they did not yet understand was that the Vietnamese were unlike any other foe. They were not fighting merely to survive. They were fighting for their land, their honor, and their very identity. At the front lines of this defense stood General Tran Hung Dao, one of Dai Viet's most brilliant commanders. Knowing that a direct confrontation against the Yuan fleet would be suicide, he used the environment as his greatest weapon. The Gulf of Tonkin, with its shifting tides, hidden reefs, and narrow passages, became a vast natural trap. In December, as the Yuan fleet sailed through Van Don carrying essential supplies for the advancing Mongol armies, the Vietnamese Navy launched a perfectly timed ambush. Exploiting their deep knowledge of the tides, they attacked just as the waters began to recede. The heavy Mongol ships, built for open seas, suddenly found themselves stuck in shallow waters. Unable to maneuver, they became easy targets for the swift and lightweight Vietnamese boats that swarmed around them. Fire arrows and spears rained from all directions. One by one, the Mongol ships caught fire and burned, their flames reflected in the dark waters of the bay. Admiral Truong Van Ho, one of the Vietnamese commanders, fell in the chaos, but his sacrifice ensured victory. The Yuan supply fleet was annihilated, and with it, the Mongol army lost its lifeline. On land, the situation quickly turned desperate for the invaders. The Mongol soldiers who had marched deep into Vietnamese territory now found themselves cut off from food and reinforcements. They roamed through empty villages, only to find granaries burned, wells poisoned, and fields destroyed. The Vietnamese had perfected the scorched earth strategy, depriving the invaders of every resource that could sustain them. This tactic, though brutal, was devastatingly effective. The once mighty army of the steppes, accustomed to rapid victories and plentiful supplies, now faced starvation and disease. Yet Prince Togon refused to surrender. Early in 1288, he marched once more into Tang Long, today's Hanoi, expecting a triumphant occupation. But the city that awaited him was silent and lifeless. Its inhabitants had fled. Its storehouses were empty. What had once been a thriving capital was now an empty shell, a city abandoned to deny the enemy any comfort. The Mongols, left with no choice, began to plunder the countryside, breaking into smaller groups to find food. But by dividing their forces, they made themselves vulnerable to relentless guerrilla attacks. The Vietnamese, guided by General Tran Hung Dao, the supreme commander and a man revered for his wisdom as much as his courage, had been waiting for this moment. Hung Dao understood that Vietnam could never defeat the Mongols in open battle. The key was to wear them down, weaken their morale, and then strike when they were most desperate. His plan was daring, precise, and steeped in historical symbolism. He chose the Bac Dang River, a narrow, tidal waterway northeast of Tang Long, as the stage for the final confrontation. The choice was no coincidence. Centuries earlier, in the year 938, the Vietnamese hero No Nguyen had achieved independence from Chinese rule at this very river, using an ingenious naval trap. Hung Dao would now repeat that feat on an even grander scale. Under his orders, thousands of wooden stakes were carved from ironwood and sharpened to deadly points. Each stake was then reinforced with an iron cap and driven deep into the muddy riverbed at low tide, forming a vast forest of underwater spears. When the tide rose, they vanished beneath the surface, making the river appear calm and safe. When the tide fell, the deadly spikes re-emerged, ready to tear through the hulls of any ship that ventured too far. This was more than a trap. It was a fusion of military genius and intimate knowledge of the land. Every tide, every current, every sandbank was calculated. It was a strategy born not from brute strength, but from patience, intelligence, and the rhythm of nature itself. By April of 1288, the stage was set. The remnants of the Yuan fleet, commanded by Admiral Omar, known in some chronicles as Soji-2, were in full retreat, desperate to escape back to the open sea. Believing the Vietnamese forces were finally exhausted, Omar led his ships down the Bac Dang River. What he did not know was that General Hung Dao's fleet was deliberately retreating, pretending to flee in panic. The Mongols, sensing victory, pursued with full force, their heavy warships charging deeper into the narrow channel. But as they advanced, the tide began to fall. The river's depth dropped rapidly. Suddenly, the Yuan ships lurched, scraping against unseen obstacles. Within moments, the great fleet came to a halt, impaled on the hidden stakes below. Then came the signal. The thunder of war drums echoed from both shores, reverberating through the misty air. Vietnamese boats, small and agile, poured out from the coves and mangroves, their sails catching the wind. Arrows darkened the sky as flaming projectiles struck the trapped Mongol vessels. The water erupted with fire and smoke. The sound of battle filled the river, the clash of steel, the crack of burning wood, and the cries of men swallowed by the tide. The Mongol sailors tried desperately to cut their way free, but it was too late. One after another, Their ships sank beneath the rising flames. Chronicles written decades later tell of the river turning red, of corpses floating so thick that they formed a grisly bridge from one bank to the other. Admirals Omar and Phan Thiep fell in the chaos, and what remained of the fleet was utterly destroyed. When the news reached Prince Togon, the proud commander who had once marched south with the might of the Mongol Empire at his back, his courage broke. He realized the invasion was lost. Pursued by relentless Vietnamese guerrillas, Togon abandoned his men and fled north through the treacherous mountain passes of Lang Son. The chronicles describe him crossing the border back into China covered in mud and tears, his armor shattered, his army gone, a symbol of total defeat. By mid-1288, the Mongol campaign in Southeast Asia was over. Kublai Khan, who had built the greatest empire the world had ever known, would never again send an army to Vietnam. The defeat at Bac Dang River marked not only the end of the invasion, but also the destruction of the myth of Mongol invincibility. The empire that had swept across Asia and Europe with unstoppable fury had been humbled, not by another great empire, but by a small nation that fought with cunning, resilience, and unity. The Bac Dang River became a sacred name in Vietnamese history. Its muddy waters, once filled with blood and wreckage, came to symbolize the spirit of resistance and the power of knowledge over brute strength. Each wooden stake buried in its depths represented more than a trap. It represented the wisdom of a people who knew their land better than any invader ever could. It was a timeless lesson that intelligence can triumph over power, and that love for one's homeland can outlast any empire. That day, Vietnam did more than defend its borders. It reshaped the destiny of Asia. From that moment forward, every empire that looked southward toward Vietnam did so with respect and caution. They knew that beneath the rain-soaked fields and quiet deltas of the Red River, a dragon slept, a dragon that would awaken whenever its homeland was threatened. If this story of Vietnam's resistance against the Mongol Empire revealed a new side of history to you, subscribe to Imperium Total to continue exploring the forgotten battles that changed the course of civilization. And let us know in the comments, do you believe the victory at Bac Dang River was the most humiliating defeat of Kublai Khan's reign? Thank you for watching, and until the next journey into the past.